Well, hello and welcome. I'm Christina Henderson, Executive Director of the Montana High Tech Business Alliance. Welcome to this webinar on the Great Resignation, Future-Proofing Your Organization with Kendall Clifton Short. This event is part of a regular series hosted by the Montana High Tech Business Alliance. You can find the details of future sessions at mthightech.org/events. Our presenter today, Kendall Clifton Short, is a partner at the global firm Within People and is based in Bozeman. After Kendall's presentation, we will open the floor up for Q&A with the audience. We would ask that you mute your microphones until you have something to say, but if you have a question or want to share during the meeting, you can either turn on your mic to speak or type your question in the chat box. Today's presentation is being recorded. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Kendall Clifton Short to get us started.
Thank you, Christina. Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here today to talk about something that, even if we don't perhaps use this language, is definitely a hot topic, and no doubt if you work and play in Montana or even anywhere in America, is something that is somewhere in your consciousness as something to think about. So today is really all about, it's a conversation, if you like, about, how do we create cultures that can attract and retain great talent as we drive growth in times of change. So obviously, you know, change is accelerating anyway. COVID brought massive amount of change really quickly. And today, what we want to talk about is what is the impact of that? How is that playing out in the economy, and what can we do about it? So let's dive in. So my name's Kendall, and Christina explained that I work as a partner at Within People. I live in Bozeman. Clearly, I wasn't born in Bozeman, but it's definitely home now. And then we also have another Within People person in Bozeman, Emily. And then we also work internationally with some partners in South Africa and also in the UK. And you know, the work that we do, that I do, is really about helping courageous leaders committed to a journey of change redesign the world of work, one person on their team at a time, and build organizations that are adaptive, impact focused, and that can unleash the collective potential of their people in service of the problems that you're solving. So today I want to talk about a couple of different things, like what is the data around the Great Resignation, and what's actually happening, and how is what's actually happening perhaps a little different to some of the stories that we hear about what's happening. Also want to spend some time diving into what's driving this phenomenon, if you like, and what are the costs of that. And then lastly, probably most importantly, what do we actually do about it? How can we build a robust, future-proof business in times of change, not only for this moment in time, which is obviously high change, but as the world continues to change, it's a relevant conversation and way of thinking about things. If you've got questions, obviously pop them in the chat. Christina and Emily will help me make sure I notice them, and we can jump into them more at the end too if I don't get to them as we're going. Oh, sorry. Okay, so let's start with the data. What's the data actually showing us? So the term, the Great Resignation, was first used in only really May, so just a moment ago in the big scheme of things, in an NBC article by Anthony Klotz. And it was really this idea that lots of people, significant numbers of people, are going to leave their jobs in a post-pandemic world. Now, of course, we're not quite in a post-pandemic world yet, but things are definitely moving towards that, and hence we're starting to see some things differently. It's called a bunch of other things too. The Society for Human Resource Management calls it the turnover tsunami. But it's really this idea that an unexpectedly large number of people will be making changes in their work life. And really today's conversation is about understanding why and what we do about it. So when we start to dive into the data, what we actually see is an upward trend of voluntary turnover. So people who aren't fired, aren't furloughed, aren't laid off, choosing to exit the workforce or choosing to exit their employment has slowly but significantly been on the rise since, or at least as long as this table is talking about, which was 2011. So it's not, so this problem that we find ourselves in today, it was a problem that was growing, but perhaps more slowly than we were, than caused us to be noticing it. So we see this great big dip here. And really what that represents is the uncertainty of the pandemic encouraging a whole bunch of people who may have been thinking about leaving their job to stay exactly where they were until they really understood the implications of the pandemic. And so now that we have some more certainty and stuff, we've had 11.5 million people across the US leave their jobs in April, May, and June of this year. And then what we can see from the graph too is, which really puts us back where we would have been pre-pandemic. It's just that that's a ton of people in a really short space of time, in response to significantly less people for a period of time. I think it's also interesting to understand this is a global trend, right? It doesn't look exactly the same in every country, but somewhere between, depending on who's done the survey and what the country is, between 25%, 1 in 4 people, up to 41%, and then sometimes the numbers even slightly higher, of people globally are thinking about leaving their jobs. Not actively doing that, but certainly it's on their mind. It's an option on the table. You know, Microsoft's surveyed more than 30,000 people across 31 countries. You know, Gallup's numbers up to 48%. So there's obviously not just one place you go to this data, but in general, a significant amount, like potentially half our workforce, is considering, maybe I don't want to work here anymore and maybe I want to work somewhere else. So it's something worth paying attention to, obviously. If we dig into that data, like in even more detail, it's not just a blanket 41% of your people are thinking about moving. There's some slight nuance. We've got some industries, the top, who are doing a lot more hiring than they have people leaving, and that's things like tech, science, research, healthcare, new tech, logistics, and transport. And that's a great problem to have. And it's sort of, the conditions are then ripe for talent wars and spiking salaries and benefits. If we flip that over where people can't find the folks to replace those leaving, and we've got significantly more turnover than hiring, government, food and beverage, telecommunications, sports clubs, and admins. And so this is really where we're seeing things opening only, like with reduced hours, not opening at all, and people who are working in these organizations feeling the burden of burnout and overwork, etc. So wherever you may sit on the spectrum, whichever bucket you perhaps fall or align most closely to, it's not, these people have no problem, they're all good, these people have all the problem. The situation creates different sorts of problems, but I think it's also important for us to recognize that it's not an equally experienced problem. It's definitely industry specific. And then if you think about how that translates to Montana, some really interesting things roll out. Okay, so why? Like, let's dive into a little bit about why is this problem, like what's causing this problem? So I mentioned this earlier in relation to the graph, but due to the uncertainty caused by the pandemic, heaps of folks who may have been on their way to quitting, or at least thinking about it, or looking out around for other options, they sort of sheltered in place. They hunkered down, they made work, you know, often in like quite radically different circumstances, and put on pause their plans to go and find other employment, because they didn't have the certainty of what life would look like and what would be a great option post-pandemic. So that's definitely part of the situation. Some of what we're experiencing is the natural rebalancing of all those people who chose not to exit the workforce due to the pandemic. We also have obviously changing demographics. Women, particularly women of color, were very much more heavily, bore the burden heavily, if you like, of having kids at home or having online schooling or having care options for their elderly parents shifting and stuff. So women were more likely to have been laid off and furloughed, and they were also the ones who more sort of disproportionately chose to voluntarily resign so that they could show up to other things in their life which previously had been managed in a way that was no longer available. Some of this problem is being fueled by lots of those, mostly women, but not only women, not yet choosing to return to the workplace because childcare, education, care is still on its way to being back to normal, if you like. But it also really helped drive some like, well, do I want to go back to normal, or is there some benefit that we didn't realize because we were on this way of living together that I'm leaning into and I actually want to play with. And then that's sort of then further exacerbated by many American households having more disposable income than they did pre-pandemic, simply because they haven't had to pay for lots of the things that were previously large ticket items in their budget. Sometimes that's childcare, sometimes that's dance class, sometimes it's all the extracurricular activities that are no longer available. Again, less so in Montana, or at least in some parts of Montana that haven't been impacted by shutdowns and temporary closure and online schooling mandates in the same way that other places in America have, but also with the expansion of a hybrid workplace, we as Montanans are now competing in a slightly larger talent situation, because lots of people both sort of are significantly more mobile when we think about remote working or hybrid working than we would have considered ourselves pre-pandemic, which is also fueling the problem. So that's definitely part of it. The other part of it is that the Great Resignation is also sort of the great discontent. So yes, we have some industry trends that paint a sort of nuanced picture. It's not really, and we have lots of rhetoric around, you know, is it the sort of government handout? Is it a pay issue? Is it a minimum wage issue? The answer is yes and no. So it's all of those things absolutely are contributing to the situation, and also it's significantly a workplace issue. The highest quit rate is among those people that we categorize as not engaged or actively disengaged workers, which tells us that something about their experience of work is fueling this lack of engagement, and that's proportionally the largest group that are then looking for other employment options. So we can't do much. Well, I mean, we have a limited capacity to think about it. When we only think about it as a pay issue, there's only so far we can try and solve the problem through pay. And if we accept that it's not just a situation impacting certain industries, but really dig into, okay, what is it about the experience of work and our workplace that is fueling this? We have lots of potential to do something about it. So that's quite an energizing way of thinking about the problem. So what's fueling the discontent? Because that's the place that we as leaders can really start to have an impact. Lots of things is the short answer, but let me unpack them all slowly. So I think, like, quite surprisingly, almost highest at the top of the ladder when we look across all of the data, dissatisfaction with career options is driving exodus from employment. So career development, like, has always been and continues to be a really strong predictor of engagement and turnover. And with the shift to different ways of working, sometimes hybrid, sometimes fully remote, lots of employees felt like they didn't have what they needed to be successful in this new reality of work. And so that then makes them concerned about what the implications of that is on their career development. So if our people don't feel like this is a great option for us long term, that lowers their engagement and heightens their disengagement, and obviously has them looking around for what might look like from the outside a better option from moving them up the career ladder. Another key driver was a desire for more flexibility. You know, we saw a massive shift from like, no one can work at home, and really sort of underlying that was a lack of trust in our workers' ability to deliver on work that they were doing at home. And so, you know, that I guess myth was sort of blown out the water when productivity was either higher or managed to remain the same when we were all starting to work from home. And then I think as we then start now seeing people return to work, and some people like wanting to go back to the office full time and wanting that for their staff, and some people wanting the flexibility to work from home either partially or permanently. And when you drill into the data a little bit more, often the C-suite and leaders sort of have higher drive for everyone to be back in the office, and everybody else has a lower drive to be in the office. So there's a little bit of a mismatch there. And when our employees are looking for flexibility and it's no longer available, or they feel like the communication or the reason for the lack of flexibility being available long term is they question whether it's no longer possible, when it has been possible, that also drives disengagement and has them looking for other jobs. We also see in the data, like there's a large lack of transparency and humanity at work. Not all of some organizations did an absolutely beautiful job of taking care of their people in the pandemic, but let's be realistic. There was let's be real, there was some really tough decisions that we had to make, and lots of people that, you know, lots of us had to lay off financially. There was just no other option. So some of us did that really well, and some of us did that not as well as perhaps our people would have liked to have experienced it. And so for people who haven't felt like their employer has showed up with either adequate empathy or adequate transparency and communication around what decisions are being made and why they're being made, our trust in our organization decreases, and of course we start looking for another job. And then I think too, we can't discredit the impact of like being forced into a new reality very quickly, really sort of allowed people an opportunity to step into really thinking about what they wanted or what a new path might look for them, sometimes out of necessity and sometimes just because they had the luxury of time in perhaps the way that they hadn't before. And so we see a lot of people rethinking what they want out of life, what their goals are, and an unwillingness to accept certain working conditions that no longer feel tenable for them when previously we thought nothing of it being that way. So that's a more slightly more nuanced picture of what the data is showing us in terms of why are our people choosing to leave us? Why are organizations finding themselves not able to retain the great talent that they were able to retain pre-pandemic? Probably don't need to spend too much time on this, but obviously the cost of losing people or not being able to find people, or keeping people but having them be super disengaged, is massive. So not engaged or actively disengaged employees can cost a company up to 18% of their salary. So for a company of only 1,000 employees, which I know is a lot, but it's also not that many, for whom they have an average salary of $50,000, that disengagement can cost like $6 million a year, which is massive, right? Every time we replace a worker, it can cost anywhere between 1/2 to 2 times the employee's annual salary, not to mention any like downtime and the burden of going and finding somebody and then retraining them and the culture ad, etc. So it's going to cost $9,000 a year to keep each disengaged worker and between $25,000 and $100,000 to replace them. So yes, it's a problem when we can't open our business, and that obviously absolutely impacts our bottom line and our profitability, but we also have massive amounts of resource in terms of money walking and energy and capacity and stuff walking out the door every day when we don't have an engaged workforce or we can't find great and keep great people. Okay, so what do we do about it now that we've painted this really beautiful rosy picture? So I think we've got a couple of ways to think about solving this problem. So future proofing really requires us to reimagine our workplaces as flexible, connected cultures. When we stop trying to think, how can I find the right person for this job right now, and start to think about how do I make my organization an organization that's going to attract great talent and keep great talent, we have a world of possibility to really like create an experience where everyone can feel valued and valued for growing and growing the organization with them. So we really want to create an organization where attracting and retaining great talent is shaped on promises, shared purpose, and the opportunity to make a difference, not just money. And this shift has sort of become the foundation of us growing into that diverse and equitable 21st century business that can navigate change in a world where change is only accelerating. And the last key piece of this is where our leaders are well equipped to develop people and nurture careers. So there's a couple of different pieces here. How do we reimagine how we work together so that we can attract and retain great people, and everyone on our team is well equipped to serve each other to continue to develop this? So that's great, right? Great philosophy or belief statement there that you've just shared, Kendall, but like, what does that actually mean? So I think it means a couple of things. First of all, we need to have really clear, like, why we're in business. Why are we doing what we're doing? Sometimes you call it purpose, mission, vision. And if you don't have that clear, obviously it's very hard to make a compelling argument about why people should come and work for you. That's not the conversation we're going to have today. We'll assume that everyone has a lot of clarity on why they're in business and why people should come and help them solve the problem that they're solving. The next piece of the puzzle is, what are we doing and what's the experience of doing it? So when I come and help you fulfill your mission or live your purpose or deliver on your vision, what is the experience of that for me as a person on your team? So let's unpack the blue circle, the employee experience, a little bit more. The first question that we all need to be able to answer very articulately as leaders is, why here? Why would someone come and work for us? So step one, we know who we are and what we stand for. Step two is, why would someone come and do this work with me and not over there with someone else who's also solving perhaps a similar problem because I care about this problem? When we can answer this question really clearly, hey, you should come and work here because of X, we do two things. I mean, how can that not be a compelling argument? It really helps us find people who want that to be their reality. And so we don't just get a whole bunch of warm bodies, we get a whole bunch of warm bodies that feel very strongly drawn to the type of experience of work that they're looking for. And then secondly, having that clarity allows us to make sure we're measuring up to it. If we have said to people, hey, you should come here so that you can like grow and develop our ideas, but yet they get here and there's no opportunity for them to contribute any sort of innovation or forward thinking or development of ideas, that there's going to be a mismatch, right? And they're going to leave because you're not living up to the promise that they were sort of lured to you from. So when we understand why us, then it's really easy for us to say, and here's how we know that this is our truth and that this is what our people are experiencing this. So once you have that clarity, okay, we know what we're doing and who we are, and we know why people would want to come and do that with us. The way that we think about this is, how can we shift from a sort of perks economy to a promises economy? So pre-pandemic, lots of people had a bunch of perks that they used to encourage people to come and choose them over a competitor: free lunch, ping pong tables, sleep pods. I know perhaps we didn't see quite as much of that in Montana, but certainly, great work in like office environment was definitely part of the sexy promise that they were, or sexy pitch that they were being made. Still a role for that, obviously. Benefits and sort of there are some tangible perks that still have a role in the conversation. And there's also an opportunity to replace some of those perks with promises. So how can we really articulate our promise to you as an employer and say, hey, our commitment to you, our promise to you of your experience of work will be this, and in return, the promise that you make for us. So we move from everything being very one-sided and transactional to everything being mutually beneficial. So I have some clarity on what I can expect from my employer, and you have some clarity about what you can expect from me as your employer. So obviously, when we can come together around mutual benefit, that's a much stronger recipe for people staying in a place, as opposed to the onus being on us as the employer to provide everything and it be one-sided and be quite transactional. So the invitation for us all here is, as we think about, once we have the clarity of why us, we then understand the promises that we're making to people, and we can start to articulate the promise we would ask of them in return. We have a really beautiful way to recontract with people around why they would want to come and partner with us to deliver on our mission, vision, purpose. Okay, so that's great. We can make some promises instead of some perks, but what should we be making some promises about is really the question that I want to dig into. And this is what the data is pointing to, if you like. Oops, sorry. So based on our data, the data that I've unpacked a little about the Great Resignation and the Great Discontent, we all are looking for work to provide us 4 things: flexibility, connection, growth, and reward. Now, they're pretty big buckets, and there's lots of different things that can fit in each of those buckets, which is beautiful because it then gives us each, in our own individual unique organization, a way to design how we provide these 4 things to people in a way that feels authentic and that is potentially going to work for us. So in our work, we see lots of organizations doing this in really different ways across industries and different markets, but the themes are consistent. So these are the 4 lenses, if you like, that we can look through to understand what should we be making promises to our people about, and how can we get really creative about our ability to deliver on these promises in the context of our workplace, because what flexibility looks like in a corporate office is very different to what flexibility is going to look like in a manufacturing plant. So let's unpack each of them a little bit so we understand, okay, what is this lens, or what is this bucket all about, and how can we start asking ourselves the right questions so that we know where the opportunities for us lie. Okay, so flexibility is all about creating inclusive, high trust environments where we can sort of unleash our creativity. And when we think about, I mentioned this statistic before, but the data is all suggesting that we were 94% as productive as we were pre-pandemic, when we were all working from home without our manager looking over our shoulder, telling us what to do next. So for all of the organizations that felt like that level of productivity was only possible in the office, that sort of myth just got blown out of the water. So now that we all our workers believe they should be trusted to work from home. How do we navigate a way forward if that doesn't feel like where we want to go? So in the flexible bucket, if you like, it's questions around like, how are we using our time? Are we managing people's time? Are they managing their time? Are we giving them opportunity to work on the projects that in a way that serves them or serves the team, or are we dictating what that should look like? How are we sort of unleashing people's ability to bring all of their talents to their role, or how are we constraining them to just providing value in one different way? What is the conversation around how and where people are working? Is that something that we're dictating to them? Is that something that we're working out in consultation with them? Is that something that they're driving? And again, all of these questions sit on a continuum, and there's no right or wrong answer, or wrong place, I should say, for where you should be. But hopefully these questions really give you an opportunity to start thinking about the way that people are doing their work for you in a slightly different way. And then the last question that we need to sort of ask ourselves is, how are we responding to everyone's needs? And if there was anything that, Black Lives Matter, and then the subsequent focus on DEI or DE and J, how there's about 5 different ways we could put those letters together. But really at the core of that is how different people have different needs. So how are we as an organization creating an environment where we can hear those different needs and then respond to them in a way that feels equitable and rewarding. So yeah, like I said, flexibility obviously looks very different in a manufacturing context to what it looks like in a corporate office. And there's still heaps of opportunity for us to bring some creativity to what flexibility can look like even in a manufacturing setting. So is there just one shift that everybody does? Is there opportunity to split shifts, or have our people doing the shifts help design the shifts that they might want to do, or work out with their team who's going to do the shifts? Is there opportunity for them to move around in different roles and at least try stuff out, if not have their time split over lots of different pieces of the manufacturing puzzle? And there are some folks in the Valley already doing a bunch of great work in this space about how do we think more flexibly about a workplace that has traditionally not been very flexible at all, and how are we really supporting our folks to come together and within the constraints of our less flexible organization, design a way that they can feel like there's some flexibility that they can step into. So the questions for us to consider as business leaders is, how can we build trust across our culture where everyone's individual needs can be heard and can be met, is sort of the core question that we want to be asking ourselves, so that the experience of that for our people is flexibility. And how do we engage our people in that conversation so that we can do that in a really powerful and authentic way? Okay, so let's move on to connected. Connected is all around transparency and inclusion, and obviously trust sits here too, but the outcome is belonging. So yes, we can include people, but unless that's a bit like inviting them to the party, but unless when they arrive, we offer them a drink and start dancing with them, they'll continue to feel like a bit of an outsider and not like they belong. So inclusion is really in service of belonging. So when people feel connected to an organization and like they belong, they are 5.3 times more likely to feel empowered to do their best work. So obviously that's significant. If we can, unleash the best of our people, then obviously our outcomes are going to be way better. So this is all about how we organize people, how we make and communicate decisions, like who gets told what, how much do we tell them, how often do we tell them, who weighed into that decision, who had a say, who didn't have a say. How does information flow in our organizations, and how are we actively doing things that create community and belonging, especially if we're either still working in a hybrid or remote way and have plans to continue to do that. So I think when the pandemic happened and all of a sudden we were all at home, we realized that, or we realized that we were hanging on to this belief that physical space was the place that culture happens, right? Which it can be true, but it also can not be true. Sometimes physical space is just where we get people together to do transactional work. So there's ways that we can create rich collaboration, virtually, in-person, hybrid, all over. And so if we let go of the ability that culture only exists in physical spaces, massive opportunity to rethink how we do culture, if you like, opens up, that can really serve organizations as they either transition to a less long-term physically bound space, which of course obviously then opens up massive opportunity when we think about the war for talent and the price of housing in lots of Montana towns, and how we can make it more sustainable for people to come and work for us and stay working for us when perhaps we aren't able to pay them what would be required for them to live comfortably in some of our towns. Yeah, so are people coming together in ways that unlock their ability to do their best work? Do they have the information they need to do their best work? And do they feel like they're supported with scaffolding and a manager who can really add and unlock what they need to then add value consistently? So the question that is a great key question for us to be thinking about is, what are the ways that we can create belonging through our values or ways of working and rituals, which are ways of coming together? So, and then how do we do that in a really authentically transparent way so that people feel like they have what they need to be successful and that they're valued and key to your company's success? Right, so let's move on to rewarding. So rewarding is really all about how can I have impact, how can my work feel meaningful, and how can I be celebrated or rewarded for the value that I've added. So the statistics, again, you know, somewhere between 10 and 20, but in general, 15% of people, people are willing to take a 15% pay cut to work for a company with purpose. So, you know, do we just say we have purpose, or are we actually living it authentically, and are people experiencing it? Do they feel connected to coming to work to do meaningful work? So pay is absolutely part of this bucket, and it's absolutely important, obviously, but money alone isn't the solution, which is great because we can't just keep paying people like infinitely more money. And some of our most well-paid people are actually our most disengaged people. So it's not just about the money. And, you know, lots of statistics sort of reinforce this. Gallup suggests that it takes more than a 20% pay rise to lure someone away from a manager where they feel a real connection to and love working for, and pretty much next to nothing to poach the disengaged worker. And when employees feel like that, pay and incentives are fair. And so that's again, like, how do we create a system of reward that feels fair and equitable now that everyone has a more nuanced understanding of what that is and what their own personal expectations around that is? How do we design a way of rewarding them that's both better for the organization and better for the employee, so that they stay engaged and stay feeling satisfied and fairly rewarded for the value that they're added. Again, I was just reading yesterday in the Edible Bozeman magazine, this amazing story of a restaurant in Livingston where a couple of, I guess, restaurant owners were sharing the toll of the pandemic and the uncertainty it created for their whole business and for the people who worked for them, One of them was saying that, you know, COVID hit, they shut down, they opened up again, then they shut down again because of the impact that the mask versus non-mask debate was really having on their staff. And so when they opened up a third time, it was pretty obvious pretty soon that they weren't really breaking even. And he was telling the story of having to share this reality with his staff and sort of say, I'm really sorry, but I'm unable to afford to operate anymore. And then, much to his surprise, all of his employees showed up to work the next day and said, hey, look, we really believe in what you're doing in the restaurant, and we're willing to pay to work just for pay. Sorry, just for tips, no pay, until the situation changes and you're able to firstly get some money from the Paycheck Protection Program, and then when capacity changed and stuff, eventually earn money so that he could slowly bring everybody onto the payroll. So I think that's a really, now, you know, we don't all have that luxury, but it's a powerful story that really speaks to when we create opportunities for people to do work that's really meaningful for them, the way that they will then follow us into the difficult and what they're willing to do in service of us being able to fulfill that mission. Okay, so what does this look like? It looks like thinking, how do we unlock people's ability to do meaningful work? How are we having conversations about what would make their work meaningful for them? And how are we then sort of creatively designing with them opportunities for that to be realized? How do we understand, like, what conversations are we having that even help us understand if people are feeling valued or not? How are we assessing performance? How are we giving people feedback so that they can grow in a really energizing and rewarding way? And of course, how do we compensate them equitably? So yeah, how are we sort of recognizing people for their add to our culture, as well as their add to our profitability, knowing that those two things are actually directly related, obviously. So some key question for us to all think about, like, what are the ways that we can ensure everyone has the opportunity to do meaningful work? Because without that opportunity, disengagement soars, and disengagement is one of the leading causes of people then looking for other work. All right, last lens, if you like, which is this growing bucket. So how are we helping people feel balanced, feel like they have a level of well-being and like they are being developed? We saw earlier how important career development was in people's paradigm of whether this is the right place for them. So what are we doing to provide meaningful opportunities for growth? How are we navigating and resolving conflict? How are we fostering and supporting well-being? You know, obviously many of our people now have different burdens on them, and being able to show up to them is a different priority. So how well are we serving them? And how are we really sort of growing the individual as a means to growing our business? And how are we engaging our people in co-designing a path for growth that both inspires them and really serves the company? So the key question here we can ask ourselves is, what are the ways that we can support personal growth that responds to both individual needs and equitable needs, and as a path for our business development growth? If somebody wants to learn to tap dance, well, perhaps that's not part of the conversation, but yeah, how can we find ways to grow our people and help them prioritize their well-being so that they can continue to show up and not get burnt out? And this is part of this is, how do we set people up for success? How do we celebrate people's strengths? How do we leverage those strengths? And how do we provide the support for everybody to thrive in our organization? And, you know, I think I forgot to read the statistic last time, sorry, but like 42% of people, of Gen Z people, think that they want to start their own business, right? So they see often this job as a step on that journey, right? So I've had people say to me, well, what if we invest a whole bunch of time training and growing our employees and then they leave? And I think the counter question, the more important question is, well, what if we don't and then they stay? So how can we sort of hold more loosely to the idea that if we invest training in people, then they should invest in our company, not necessarily forever, but for the long term, and see, okay, even if this training that I'm providing people access to then means that they can go and get a different job, not all of them will want to, and I will get more out of them for that investment, even in the short term, than I would if I was to choose not to make it. Okay, so we've kind of gone through 4 lenses: flexible, connected, growing, and rewarding. And that really sort of brings us back to where we started. So once you know who you are, obviously assuming that you do, how this conversation, sort of future-proofing ourselves against the Great Resignation, is really a conversation about what is the experience of coming to work for you, and how can we rethink that so that that's something that is really energizing for people. And I think too, the other piece of this puzzle that we haven't really talked about is we can do the thinking about what we want the employee to experience, and we can ask ourselves all those great questions. And we also need managers who can then, or the next, depending on how big we are, the next level of leadership down, with the skills to then bring that to life. So do we know who we are? Do we know why people would come and work for us, and what we're promising the experience of work to be, and are we living up to that? And then part of the living up to that is, do we have the people with the right skills to be able to help us deliver that and show up to that promise, so that there's no reason that anyone would go and work for anybody else, and they are very happy with how we are growing them and providing opportunities for reward and flexibility and connection. I could just talked really quite quickly for quite a lot. I know there's a lot, and I know sometimes we come to webinars like this and hope that we just get like the one thing we can do to future-proof our organization. The reality is it's a complex problem that, yes, we need to solve in the context of the pandemic, but we also need to solve in the context of the rate of change in the world. So my hope is that something has resonated, and that also the investment in thinking about this question quite holistically pays off in dividends. So I'd love to hear any questions. This conversation is sort of just a piece of the puzzle of what we do, which all fits loosely in this sort of within way bucket, but I'm not going to unpack that now. I think we'll just see if there are any questions.
Yeah, if folks have questions, you can either type in the chat or just turn on your microphone and ask. Give anybody a shot here. Kendall, I'm curious. I mean, you've been doing this work, you and Within People have been doing this work for a number of years. Are there key things that have changed that you've been seeing recently related to this shift that you think are interesting? Like, are there things that have changed about the advice you're giving, or the problems that folks are having related to this issue?
I think that's a great question, Christina. I think the thing that's shifting is people's understanding of how we go about solving this problem. And I think before it was sort of like, well, what's your EVP? What's your employee value proposition? Like, what are you pitching to an organization? And now it's kind of like, and how do you back that up with the experience of work when they get here? So there's this realization that the pitch or the promise is not enough. It has to then be embodied in the experience of work. And I think the other thing that's shifted a lot is it's no longer as easy as perhaps we thought it was, or were able to manage to have it, as work sat here and life sat here, and they were fairly disconnected. If there's one thing that I think we're heading that way anyway, but the pandemic absolutely accelerated massively, is those two things sit like this, right? And so the role that we as employers need to play in fostering well-being for people is completely different. So that used to be your problem that you did in your time, and this work stuff used to be my problem that I helped you manage in my time. And now, like, the intersection of that is massively intertwined. And I think we are also seeing shifts in people's resiliency. And so if resilience is our ability to show up and navigate change, then in a world that's massively changing more quickly than it has been, and with that therefore has impacts on people's resiliency. And so with resiliency going down and change going up, that means that well-being seems to be playing a much bigger role in the workplace and in work culture, or in the domain of HR, than perhaps it ever was before.
We have a question from Chris. What do you see is Montana's experience in this Great Resignation? What issue or need to address with Montana employees, or do we need to address with Montana employees or those looking for other opportunities, rural, urban, etc.?
From where I'm standing, and obviously I only have limited view, this is a problem in Montana, obviously. And I think there is still a large belief that it's just a pay and benefits problem. And I think that's exacerbated by obviously people no longer needing to be in a physical office. And so we have a massive influx of people coming, driving up housing prices. So the Montana wage that we used to be able to pay people and have them live comfortably is no longer serving people. And so there's quite a lot of pressure on employers to be able to reward people in a way that better aligns with the quality of living that they are looking for. And if we can't do that as employers, and we're not thinking holistically about the experience of work, I mean, we still need to be able to feed ourselves, then that puts us at lower down the pole of potential options than people who can do that. So I think the influx of people is driving trends here. The fact that we are now, as Montana businesses, potentially trying to compete with states who can pay people more, do pay people more, again, puts us at a disadvantage. And why would you want to work for a Montana business? So you can live in Montana, right? So if a Montana business is offering remote options, and we get the what's traditionally been sort of a lower pay in a state like this because of the lifestyle that we were looking for, and we were willing to do that, you know, that's not really attractive to a virtual employee who's still living in perhaps a high cost of living town and stuff. So that's definitely impacting this situation. I think a sort of one-dimensional, in some cases, not all cases, there's some really progressive organizations in the state too, but potentially a more one-dimensional belief around where the solution is, just resting on pay or rest, and then also I wouldn't say like naivety, but like it's much easier problem to think about navigating if it could just be about things like, well, if we stop paying people government handouts, everybody will come back to work. Now, that's unfortunately not true, right? Because it's complex, and you know, it's like we've been talking about. So the more willingness we can, or the more willing we can become, if you like, to step into the nuance of the situation, and the quicker we can see, hey, there's a massive opportunity here, right? If we can think about these things quite progressively, and we can really create an experience of work that puts us as that employer of choice. And there's organizations already doing this, right? The ones who aren't having to close on certain days because they don't have enough staff, they're doing this, right? So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Chris, but I think, how do we recognize and step into the complexity of the problem is a real opportunity that we can use to address the issue. And how do we understand that sort of cost benefit of like hybrid versus virtual versus in person, and again, the like system-wide implications of all of that for the people who would want to come and work for us.
Okay, Chris says yes, thanks. So I think he got an answer.
Great.
Does anybody else pipe up? But Courtney is here. She and I are actually on the same conference microphone, so she's going to speak through my mic.
Yeah, so going back a few slides, we just talked about kind of the whole Montana view, but I'm interested in like the global trends. And I know that that chart might look a little different country by country. And I'm wondering if you know anything about like certain countries where maybe like the Great Resignation is more of a problem and why that might be, just any trends there.
No, I don't think there's any country where it's more of a problem. I think that America is, no problem, Chris, thanks. I think America has the biggest problem, to be honest. But of course, it's not, you know, it's not experienced exactly the same across the whole of America, just like it's not experienced across the whole of the world. There's lots of data around how relief packages or like payment protection plans or like JobKeeper or whatever you want to call it in different organizations is then shaping the return to work paradigm. And there's obviously countries with significantly more of a social safety net than America that are seeing much less, significantly lower impacts to their economy, because there are things in place that support people to be able to return to work in a way that doesn't exist in this country. So yeah, I don't think this problem is bigger in any other country. Obviously some countries, like not first world countries, are still massively in the grips of COVID. That's a completely different situation. That's not like, we can't compare their economic situation with our economic situation because of the amount of people who have been impacted by and continue to be impacted by the virus in a way that we are no longer. Yes, it's still impacting us significantly, but significantly less so than it has been, and hence why our economy is able to start recovering in the way that it has and third world countries or second world countries aren't in that place yet. So it's unfair to compare the trends in those countries. But of the first world countries, certainly like the reshaping of what's important to me is being felt across the globe. But the actual translation of that into people leaving and people being able to manage that leaving. And then also that it's also slightly unfair to compare to some countries for whom the loss of life for COVID is significantly less. And so the amount of workers relative to the amount of workers that they had even available to their workforce is a different reality in America too. And again, different reality for different states across America. So it's hard to make too broad a sweeping generalization. I don't know if I've answered your question either, Courtney.
Super interesting, thank you.
All right, we maybe have time for one more question. If anyone has a burning question on their minds, please speak now. All right, I think then we'll wrap things up. If you have additional questions for Kendall, topics that you'd like to ask her about, reach out to us and we can connect you with her. A video recording and resources, the slides from today's session, will be emailed to everyone who registered, so you can share that with colleagues or review any of the information that was especially compelling. Once again, thank you, Kendall. Thank you to our audience for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Christina.